January 17, 1946. The cold, biting wind of post-war Germany stings the skin as the morning light filters through the barbed wire of a makeshift POW camp. The air is thick with tension, a lingering reminder of years spent in captivity. Inside the camp, the stillness is broken by a surprising announcement. For the first time in years, the German women prisoners are told they may walk freely around the camp. The shock is palpable. These women who had endured hunger, fear, and unimaginable hardship now face the incomprehensible, the freedom to move. They stand frozen in disbelief, unable to fathom what this sudden shift means for them. A murmur of disbelief ripples through the camp as they look to one another, unsure whether to trust what they've just heard. Could it be true? Would their years of suffering truly end with such an unexpected act of mercy? The end of World War II marked a turning point in the way prisoners of war were treated. The years of conflict had ravaged Europe, leaving entire countries in ruins, and the treatment of POWs, particularly those from the Axis powers, had varied dramatically depending on the circumstances. As the Allies advanced, they captured soldiers from Germany and its allies, with the women of the German military finding themselves in an unfamiliar, harrowing position. Unlike the men whose fate was often sealed by direct combat or immediate imprisonment, the women found themselves caught in a complex web of wartime perceptions and post-war policies. By 1945, with the Allies firmly in control of the German territories, the international community was grappling with the question of how to handle the millions of prisoners left behind. The Geneva Conventions, which had governed the treatment of prisoners, remained a theoretical framework. In practice, however, the care and conditions varied widely. The German women, many of whom had been conscripted or volunteered for war work, were suddenly treated not as soldiers, but as civilians caught in the consequences of a nation's collapse. The immediate aftermath of the war placed them in camps not for their roles in combat, but for their associations with the defeated German regime. Women's camps were different from their male counterparts. They weren't just centers for containment, but symbols of the shifting attitudes toward gender, power, and retribution. Unlike male POWs, who often faced harsher, more militaristic treatment, the women were placed in less fortified, often smaller camps. Still, conditions were grim. These women lived in constant fear, surrounded by barbed wire and the looming presence of their captors. They faced physical hardships with minimal food rations, inadequate shelter, and forced labor. Yet, despite the brutality, there was something more complex about their experience. Their position as women in a war that had largely been fought by men. The camps were places of emotional and psychological turmoil. The German women prisoners, many of whom had worked in factories or served in auxiliary roles in the Wehrmacht, found themselves at the mercy of Allied forces with little understanding of what would come next. These women had been raised under Nazi ideology, which positioned them in supportive but secondary roles in the war effort. Now, after Germany's defeat, they were left to grapple with their identities, neither victors nor direct participants in the violence, yet deeply tied to the legacy of the war. As the Allies began to consolidate control over these POW camps, the treatment of these women became more humanitarian in approach. But that didn't mean kindness. For many women, the memory of their past lives as soldiers or workers under the Nazi regime would haunt them for years. Their eventual release or transfer to other camps was a slow process, with some being held for years after the war's official end. As the war ended and the Nuremberg trials began to define the fate of the Nazi leadership, the world's attention shifted to the human cost of the conflict. The fate of female prisoners of war, especially German women, was a matter of legal and moral debate. The Allies, who had fought to bring an end to the brutalities of the Nazi regime, now found themselves confronted with their own moral dilemmas. The German women were, in essence, prisoners of a war they did not start, but had been forced to participate in under an oppressive regime. This created an uncomfortable paradox for the Allied forces. How should they treat those who were both victims and perpetrators, or at least complicit by association? In the months following the end of the war, the treatment of female POWs became a subject of considerable debate among the Allied nations. The United States, the United Kingdom, and the Soviet Union all handled these women differently, depending on their priorities. For the Americans and the British, the main concern was not necessarily retribution, but rehabilitation. Their goal was to dismantle the remnants of the Nazi war machine and ensure that German society could rebuild itself in a more democratic image. For the Soviets, however, the treatment of German POWs, including women, was more about revenge and punishment for the atrocities committed during the war. In the camps, the women were often treated as an afterthought. They were not regarded as enemy combatants in the traditional sense, but rather as civilians who had been caught up in the war effort. This distinction led to a more lenient treatment, though still harsh by any standard. Unlike the men, many of whom faced execution or forced labor, the women were given relatively better conditions in comparison. However, this did not mean they were spared the trauma of war. The psychological toll of the war, the captivity, and the uncertainty of what would happen next weighed heavily on them. It was in this post-war climate that the POW camps began to evolve. The women's camps, initially designed to hold them in relative isolation, were eventually transformed into places where the women could start to rebuild their lives. The Allies, especially the British, were quick to recognize that the usual methods of harsh confinement would not be the most effective for these women. Instead, they opted for a more lenient, albeit still controlled, environment. They allowed the women some measure of freedom that, although limited, was starkly different from the captivity they had known. In a surprising move, the decision was made to allow the women prisoners to walk freely within the camp's boundaries. This was not an act of charity or mercy, but rather a strategic choice. The Allied forces were increasingly aware that the war was over, and the survival of the German people, especially women, depended on creating a stable, post-war society. The decision to release some of the women's confinement symbolized a new chapter, one in which the human cost of war would be acknowledged, and some of the punishments of the past would be tempered by the realities of peace. The moment the German women POWs were told they could walk freely around the camp was not just a breaking of physical boundaries, but an emotional and psychological rupture. For years they had lived in constant fear and uncertainty, confined by barbed wire, their every movement restricted. These women, many of whom had once been civilian workers, nurses, or members of auxiliary military units, had now become pawns in a larger geopolitical struggle. The announcement, though seemingly simple, shattered the expectations they had formed after months of brutal confinement. The initial reaction was one of disbelief, followed by a quiet hesitance. Could it be true? Some stood frozen, unable to comprehend the significance of the words. Others looked to each other for reassurance, uncertain if this was a trick. But as the hours passed, the realization began to set in. They were free to move, within the confines of the camp at least. For these women, many of whom had endured hunger, disease, and mental exhaustion, the ability to walk unescorted was a monumental shift in their experience of captivity. It was a glimpse of the life they had once known, a reminder of their humanity in a time when it had often been stripped away. The decision to allow the women prisoners to walk freely within the camp was not merely an act of kindness, but a calculated move by the Allied forces. In the aftermath of a brutal and long-lasting war, the Allies understood that the reconstruction of Germany was not just a physical task but a psychological one. By giving these women the freedom to walk, the Allies aimed to signal the end of one era of warfare and the beginning of another, one rooted in reconciliation, albeit within the rigid boundaries of power. The camp commanders, especially those from the British and American forces, realized that this act of leniency would have profound psychological effects on the prisoners. It was a soft power move, a gesture of control disguised as compassion. The prisoners might feel momentarily liberated, but they remained under the watchful eyes of their captors. The Allies knew that after years of intense conflict, the human element of war, especially the mental and emotional scars, had to be addressed if peace was to be maintained. The act of granting freedom to these women was therefore as much about maintaining order as it was about ending the cycle of brutality. The women's POW camps, though built with some of the same basic infrastructure as those for men, were more improvisational. They were less fortified, with fewer surveillance systems in place, which allowed for the possibility of granting some freedom of movement. The technology of war, including the advancements in surveillance and communication, had dramatically altered the nature of captivity by the end of WT. By 1946, The Allies had access to more sophisticated technologies that allowed them to monitor and control prisoners without the need for physical confinement. Radio communication, for example, made it easier to maintain contact with the camps and relay orders without having to physically patrol every part of the camp. In addition, the ability to monitor prisoner movements via limited surveillance allowed for the relatively controlled freedom granted to the women. The technology had changed the way POWs were managed, making their lives more closely monitored, but less overtly restrictive. The decision to allow the German women POWs the freedom to move within the camp came from the leadership of the Allied forces, specifically from those tasked with overseeing the treatment of POWs in the post-war period. This move was not an easy decision for the military leaders who had to balance the need for strict control with the growing realization that the war was over and the time for vengeance was past. For leaders like General Dwight D. Eisenhower and British commanders, the focus shifted from fighting the war to rebuilding the future. They understood that the treatment of POWs would shape the relationship between the Allies and the German people in the coming years. While not all commanders were in favor of leniency, the leaders overseeing the women's camp saw this decision as a practical step toward beginning the process of reconciliation. It was a move designed to break the cycle of hostility, demonstrating, to the women and to the wider world, that they would not be treated with the same brutality they had once inflicted upon others. However, there was a fine line between mercy and power. The Allies were still the victors, and the decision to allow these women freedom came with the understanding that they were still prisoners under the supervision of their captors, reinforcing the reality that control was always within the hands of the Allied forces. For the German women POWs, the announcement that they could walk freely within the camp came as a shock, not just because of the physical liberation it promised, but because of the deep psychological impact it had on them. These women had been raised under the Nazi regime, surrounded by propaganda and ideals that encouraged blind obedience to the Führer. They had seen their country torn apart, their families shattered, and now they faced the stark reality of their own role in a war that had cost millions of lives. Many of these women were not active combatants, but had served as workers in factories or as auxiliaries in the German military. Yet they had been caught up in the war effort, and as a result they were treated as enemies. When they were told they could walk freely within the camp, their feelings were mixed, a combination of relief, confusion, and perhaps even shame. The sudden shift in treatment by their captors may have triggered deep reflections about their own complicity in the war, though many struggled with the notion of being punished for a conflict they had not directly instigated. These women now found themselves navigating a delicate balance between survival, guilt, and the complex emotions of being both prisoners and the defeated enemy. The decision to grant the German women prisoners some freedom raised profound moral questions about the nature of justice and retribution. These women, many of whom had played non-combatant roles during the war, were now faced with an ironic form of justice, one that emphasized psychological healing over physical punishment. The Allies, having spent years fighting a brutal and dehumanizing war, were now tasked with deciding what to do with the women who had served under the Nazi regime. Could they be held accountable for the actions of a regime they had been forced to serve? Or, as many of the women might have argued, were they victims of circumstances beyond their control? Granting them freedom within the confines of the camp, despite the apparent leniency, was a moral gamble. On one hand, it was a recognition that the war was over and that humanity should begin to heal. On the other, it carried a risk. By showing mercy, the Allies might have sent the wrong message to the world, signaling that there were no consequences for those involved with the Nazi regime. The women's newfound freedom, though limited, was a complex moral compromise that left many wondering whether true justice had been served, or if it was just another chapter in the murky moral landscape that the war had left behind. The moment of truth arrived on an ordinary morning in 1946, a moment that would reverberate in the minds of the German women prisoners for years to come. As the camp commander made the announcement, there was an eerie stillness among the women. The words, "You are free to walk within the camp," hung in the air, leaving an uncomfortable silence in their wake. The shock was immediate. followed by a wave of disbelief. The women, who had spent so many months confined within the harsh walls of the camp, staring at the barbed wire as the emblem of their captivity, now found themselves facing a paradox. Could they truly walk without guards trailing them, without the ever-present fear of retribution? For a few moments, no one moved. Some women stood in place, processing the announcement as if waiting for the catch, the trap hidden beneath the surface. Others exchanged confused glances, unsure of what this sudden shift in treatment meant. The camp, which had been a place of rigid structure and fear, suddenly seemed more like a temporary haven, though still marked by the presence of guards and watchful eyes. There was no grand ceremony, no fanfare, just a quiet, surreal change. It was a simple moment, but the emotional weight it carried was immense. The women, who had once been denied even the smallest bit of dignity, were now given a sliver of freedom. The choice was theirs, to take a step, to explore the boundaries of the camp that had confined them for so long. But even in this small act, there was fear. Was this freedom just an illusion? Could they walk freely without being punished for it later? Yet, despite the uncertainty, many women began to move cautiously, taking small, tentative steps towards what they had been denied for so long. They walked past the rows of barracks under the gaze of the ever-watchful guards. The ground beneath their feet, which had once felt like an extension of their confinement, now felt different. A reminder that the war was over, but the psychological scars it left behind were far from gone. As the women began to test the boundaries of their newfound freedom, the atmosphere in the camp shifted. The tension, once thick with the weight of captivity, slowly began to lift. They walked, some hesitantly, others more boldly, across the barren campgrounds. But this freedom, though seemingly a small act of mercy, became a profound turning point in their psychological journey. For the first time in years, they could breathe, not just physically, but emotionally. Their steps were tentative but deliberate, each movement carrying a sense of liberation they hadn't expected to experience in a war-torn world. The camp's commanders watched closely, observing how the women responded to their unusual treatment. To the Allies, this act was part of the larger strategy of psychological reconstruction, a signal to the prisoners that the war was over, and so too should be the brutality. But for the prisoners themselves, the experience was more complex. It wasn't just about moving freely within the camp. It was a reminder of everything they had lost and a stark contrast to the life they had known. These women were, after all, prisoners of a vanquished enemy, caught between guilt and victimhood. They were now free to walk. But was this the first step toward a life of true freedom, or simply a controlled illusion designed to ease the transition? For many of the women, the experience was overwhelming. They had spent years confined in grim conditions, where every step was controlled by fear. The idea that they could walk without being immediately herded back into their cells was something they had never truly considered. The moment of walking freely became not just an act of personal liberation, but also a deeper metaphor for the end of an era. The war that had defined their lives was over, but the remnants of it still haunted them, not just in the memories of violence, but in the quiet moments of unexpected freedom that felt foreign and unsettling. Some of the women began to talk to one another, quietly and nervously, as they walked together in small groups. Their conversations were fragmented, filled with both relief and sorrow. They shared stories of their lives before the war, of families lost, of homes destroyed, and of the years spent in captivity. In those moments, the lines between prisoner and civilian blurred. Though they were still under the watch of the camp's guards, their humanity had been partially restored. The emotional weight of the past could never be fully erased, but for a fleeting moment, the women allowed themselves to feel like human beings again, not just enemies to be watched or punished. The aftermath of that moment of freedom was not marked by dramatic changes in the physical world of the camp. The barbed wire remained, the watchful eyes of the guards stayed, and the women, though given temporary liberty within the camp, were still prisoners of war. But the psychological shift was undeniable. The women who had once been subject to the harsh realities of imprisonment began to experience a gradual, though profound change in how they perceived themselves and their captors. The shock of being told they could walk freely stayed with them for a long time, as it signaled an end to their long period of humiliation and helplessness. It was as if the walls of the camp, which had seemed so impenetrable, had somehow loosened their grip, offering the women a glimpse of a different life, one where they could stand, even if only within confined boundaries as free individuals. In the weeks that followed, the women were released from the camp in waves, some returning to Germany while others were transferred to more permanent settlements for displaced persons. The decisions of what to do with these women were complex and varied. Many were caught in bureaucratic limbo, as the Allies debated whether to repatriate them or leave them in holding camps until their status could be decided. For the women who were repatriated, the return to Germany was an emotional journey filled with mixed emotions: pride in surviving, shame for being part of the defeated enemy, and an uncertain future. The memory of their time in captivity stayed with them, shaping the way they viewed themselves and the world around them in the years to come. The decision to allow them freedom within the camp, though seemingly small, had long-lasting effects. It symbolized a shift in Allied policy towards the treatment of POWs, particularly women. While the brutalities of earlier years were still fresh in the minds of many, the act of giving these women even a small measure of freedom represented a new chapter in post-war Europe. It wasn't just about revenge or punishment anymore. It was about rebuilding a shattered society and beginning the process of healing, both physically and emotionally. Though the women may have initially doubted the sincerity of their captors' actions, the shift in their treatment provided a glimmer of hope. It was a subtle but significant step towards reconciling with the trauma of war, an acknowledgement that even in the aftermath of the greatest destruction in history, humanity could still find a path toward forgiveness, however complicated and fraught with emotion that path might be. As the women were gradually released from the camps, the long-term consequences of their treatment continued to reverberate throughout their lives. The initial shock of their newfound freedom within the camp gradually gave way to the complexity of reintegration into a shattered post-war society. For many, the war had altered their identities in ways they could not immediately comprehend. Some had served as nurses or factory workers, others had been caught in the machinery of Nazi ideology, but they all shared the same experience of captivity and the collective trauma that came with it. Returning to Germany was not simply a return to normalcy. It was a return to a society forever scarred by the consequences of the war. The women's lives post-camp were fraught with contradictions. On the one hand, they were freed from the oppressive conditions of the POW camp, but on the other, they carried the psychological weight of their experiences. For many, the trauma of the war and their captivity stayed with them long after their release. They struggled to rebuild their lives in a world that had shifted beyond recognition. Many were left with the question of what it meant to be free, not just in the physical sense, but emotionally and mentally. The women had been given the gift of physical freedom in the camp, but the true journey toward recovery would prove to be a much longer and more difficult process. The political landscape in Germany was changing rapidly in the aftermath of the war. The country was in ruins, and the Allies, while providing some aid, were also imposing a new order. The treatment of women POWs during this period was seen as part of the larger narrative of post-war justice. While some saw the act of granting freedom within the camp as a step toward healing, others believed it represented a lack of true accountability for the crimes of the Nazi regime. The complexities of guilt, responsibility, and mercy intertwined, making the lives of the former prisoners even more challenging. While some women returned to their families, trying to rebuild lives in a Germany struggling to find its place in the world, others were left to confront the emotional scars left by their years in captivity. The women had been treated as prisoners, but they had also been pawns in a larger political game. The experience of being told they could walk freely within the camp, though a symbolic moment of liberation, would never erase the years of pain and uncertainty they had endured. In the years that followed, as Germany began to recover, these women quietly became part of the greater story of war's aftermath. They lived with the memory of that strange moment of freedom within the camp, and their lives, though they may have moved forward, were never completely free from the shadows of their wartime experiences. The event of the German women POWs being granted the ability to walk freely within the confines of the camp remains a powerful testament to the complexities of post-war reconciliation. It was not just a moment of physical freedom, but an emotional crossroads, marking the intersection of trauma, survival, and a world in transition. These women, who had lived through the horrors of war and captivity, were suddenly faced with a profound psychological shift. The freedom to walk was a subtle yet significant acknowledgement of their humanity, in a world that had long denied them it. In the broader context, this event symbolizes the fragile path from conflict to peace. It reflects the tenuous balance between mercy and justice, between retribution and healing. The world had just witnessed the devastation of the most brutal war in human history, and yet, even in the aftermath, there remained a search for humanity, for redemption, and for the possibility of forgiveness. The decision to allow these women a small degree of liberty was not without its moral ambiguities. Still, it represented a conscious effort to close the door on the war's horrors and begin the arduous journey toward rebuilding, not just physical infrastructure but the fractured human psyche. For these women, the impact of that single moment would linger for the rest of their lives. The freedom they experienced, though confined within the boundaries of a POW camp, symbolized something much larger, the beginning of a new chapter in their personal histories and in the collective narrative of a war-torn Europe. It was a quiet, almost invisible moment in history, but it encapsulated the profound psychological toll of war and the deeply personal ways in which the legacy of conflict continues to shape lives long after the guns fall silent. In the end, this event serves as a reminder of the cost of war on the human soul, especially for those who never truly chose to fight. The ability to walk freely was not just an act of mercy, it was a delicate attempt to heal a world still struggling to understand the full weight of the scars left behind. It was an act of grace, but also a testament to the resilience of the human spirit which, despite being torn apart by war, still sought freedom, even in the most unexpected places.